Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. My name is Sarah Cawley. I am the Executive Director of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. We are the hosts of today's program, so thank you again for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, this program is going to be recorded and put onto our YouTube channel. Please feel free to check that out later, as we have many other educational videos on there. I am going to start this program by just reading our land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge Native peoples who have lived on this land for millennia. Their dedication to the land and their communities runs deep within the hearts of those past, present, and future. This dedication encourages the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation to continue developing among diverse communities an understanding of and an appreciation for the commitment of Native peoples to this nation and the significance of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And with that, I'm also just going to introduce Meghan. I know a lot of you folks know her apparently, which is great. But Meghan is a writer, an artist, and a seeker of grand adventures. She is working as a historical interpreter out of Boston, Massachusetts. In the summer of 2021, she spent 4 months biking the Lewis and Clark Trail from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, down the Ohio River, up the Missouri to its source, and across the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. She has been researching and writing a novel on the Lewis and Clark expedition as well. In this program, Meghan will discuss what led her to bike the trail, how she mapped her route, and tell lots of stories to us about some of the highlights along the trail. So thank you, Meghan, for doing this for us. I mentioned to you earlier that we are going to be trying to get people back on the trail, to recreate the trail, on the trail again, and really use it to its best and fullest potential. So I'm excited to bring you in and to have you today. And with that, I will turn it over to you. Folks, just a reminder, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. At the end of this program, we will have an opportunity for questions. So you can, at that point in time, unmute yourself and turn your camera on. But for the remainder of this program, please, let's just give Meghan our full attention. So thank you so much.
All right, so I'm going to reiterate a little bit of what Sarah just said, but my name is Meghan Boehmer, and last year, I spent 4 months biking the Lewis and Clark Trail. I'm an author, an artist, and a historical interpreter out of Boston, Massachusetts. So in this talk, I'm going to cover why I chose to bike the trail, how I planned biking the trail, and then the highlights and struggles along the way. And I am leaving time at the end for some question and answer. So first of all, why I decided to bike the Lewis and Clark Trail. I started planning a road trip along the Lewis and Clark Trail because I am writing a novel about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as I was writing, I was realizing that there were so many places that I had no concept of what they actually looked like, and I wanted to see them in person. And I got interested in Lewis and Clark because I was out in the mountain states and passing by so many Lewis and Clark related historic sites. And I bought the journals at Pompey's Pillar in Montana and immediately read them. They were abridged. And then I read Undaunted Courage, and I have not stopped reading about Lewis and Clark or anything tangentially Lewis and Clark. So I got to the point in writing where I was writing about the Missouri River. I've made it all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to the Missouri River in my novel, and realized there are cliffs in Missouri that I don't know what they look like. And I tried to research. I bought a book of artwork by Charles Fritz, trying to find out what these specific cliffs look like, because there's one journal entry where Meriwether Lewis flips off a cliff and catches himself by his knife, and I had no idea what that even would look like. So I decided I needed to go there in person. And as I started figuring out how I was going to do this trip in person, I started realizing that I really wanted to know what the struggle of waking up every morning and having to work yourself to the bone and then going to bed at night and having to do it all over the next day was. And I felt like that was going to be the most authentic Lewis and Clark experience that I could get. So I'm a big cyclist. I commute by bike, and during the pandemic, I got more and more interested in biking long distances. So it turned into a bike trip. So how I planned my trip, first of all, I found every national park, state park, campground, nature site, Lewis and Clark historic site, tangential historic sites, indigenous museums or galleries, recreation areas, and grocery stores that were along the way, because I didn't want to go any point without knowing where I was going to be able to sleep that night, or if I was going to be able to get food before the next grocery store. So I made this Google map and included a very meticulously organized, those symbols mean something, every single type, to figure out where my stops would be if I needed to stop along the way. The Adventure Cycling Association has a set of maps for the Lewis and Clark Trail, but they start out of Hartford, Illinois, which is where Camp Du Bois is. So they go from Hartford, Illinois on the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific, and have spurs and alternate routes along the way that closely hug the river. They're bike safe routes for the most part. But from Pittsburgh to Hartford, Illinois, there's nothing official. So I used a few different apps, including Komoot, which is the international biking app that most people default to. A lot of people recommended Ride with GPS to me, so I also used that, as well as Map My Ride to keep track of how many miles I was riding in a day, and Google Maps if I needed to get somewhere specific while I was in town. So on May 9th, 2021, I left from Fort Pitt, since I wanted the feel of leaving a fort, even though that was not the fort that Lewis and Clark left from. It is a fort that is still there and has a beautiful museum inside. So my mom told me, she was the one to drive me to Pittsburgh when I started my trip. She told me that I did not have to leave this day, and that I did not have to do the bike trip if I did not want to, that nobody would judge me for giving up at this point. But I had it in my head that if I got through this first day, that I was going to be able to make it in the end, make it all the way to the end. And spoiler, I made it to the end. So I was not wrong there. So when I got to Pittsburgh, I realized very quickly that the Appalachian Mountains extend further west than I realized. And I assumed that because I was keeping to the river, I would be going along flat paths for the most part. I was wrong. I was very wrong. I was climbing up regularly to the tops of the ridge lines, and then riding along the ridge line, and then back down, and then back up, because there's highways mostly along the river, and some of them are just not bikeable, not safe to bike. So I have a quick quote of something that I wrote about the hills that I was biking through. I called them a constant breach of green hills above red clay banks. So Grave Creek Burial Mound was the first site that I arrived at that was specifically mentioned in the journals and that I could actually explore. And for the most part, it is very similar to how it would have been when Lewis stumbled upon it in his journey down the Ohio River. Obviously, the paving and the steps that go to the top would not have been there. And sometime in the 19th century, they built a dance platform on top, which is a uniquely 19th century disrespectful thing to do to a Native American site. But it is an ancient burial ground. It is not Shawnee like many of the burial grounds in the area are. So after that, this is the Augusta Ferry, which anytime that I had an opportunity to go on a boat on the river, I took that opportunity. I took any ferry that I heard about or found in my research. I took any steamboat that I was allowed to go on. So this is the ferry here, and a look of on the Ohio River from the water. The Augusta Ferry started running in 1798. So in theory, it was running when the keelboat went through the area, and because the water level was so low when when Lewis was going down the Ohio with the keelboat. I don't know if it was literally running as they were going by. But along the shoreline in Augusta were a bunch of brick houses that were built in the 18th century. So they were right up against the river. It seemed like an area that probably trade goods were sent into. And I was very excited to see that there were actual sites that would have been seen from the river in Lewis's time. So next I was in Louisville, Kentucky. I planned to take one day off in Kentucky because at that point I'd been biking for about 2 weeks straight and I hadn't taken any time off at all. And I lost my journals while I was there, not to mention by the time I got to Louisville, it was the third time that I needed to get bike repairs because my bike was not changing gears and I was going through these mountains, and half of the time I had to walk up the hills instead of actually biking up them because my bike would not change gears. So I decided to spend a day in Louisville, which I did not regret. I managed to have some mint juleps. I went on the Belle of Louisville. So once again, I experienced the Ohio River from the water, and I managed to go to the Falls of the Ohio and see what the falls look like now. And I realized how much dams have changed the landscape. The Ohio River experiences flooding every spring, and I was arriving at campgrounds that were flooded out because the flooding season hadn't ended. They hadn't repaired the campgrounds yet. So right now, the Falls of the Ohio are fossil beds that you can hike on, and I think that occasionally they choose to flood it out, but it is where the falls would have been are mostly not covered by water anymore, and there's a lock that detours the water on the other side. So after that, I wound up befriending a couple in Carrollton, Kentucky, right before I got to Louisville, who took me around to town in a golf cart and fed me dinner. And while we were touring the town of Carrollton, Kentucky, I found out that the George Rogers Clark house had been burned down the day before that I arrived. It was the night that I was in Carrollton. The house had been burned down. I decided to go see it anyway because I wanted to know what the view was from the house that William Clark would have seen when he was staying with his brother. So you can see in the bottom left the remains of the George Rogers Clark house. I don't know what it looks like today, but as you can see, it was burnt down so recently that there was still caution tape up, and they do know that it was an arsonist who burned the house down. Shortly after that, I left the trail to go to my best friend's wedding, and in those first few weeks of biking, I had been chased by so many dogs that I was building it up in my head, and I was getting afraid to go back to the trail, and I was questioning whether or not I was actually going to be able to mass up the courage to do it, because I had had quite a few near misses being chased by dogs. I was being chased by about 3 a day. They do not fence in their dogs in Kentucky, and when I returned from the wedding, I had a very bad respiratory infection, but I biked through it, biking shorter days because I was biking through the extreme heat. I stayed at Fort Massac and went to bed at about 2 in the afternoon because I felt so ill, but I did manage to get some pictures there and enjoy the reproduction of the fort while I was there. And when I reached Shawneetown, Illinois, I was severely dehydrated. And just before I arrived at the campground, a dog started barking at me and chasing me. And I got up the courage to get off my bike and shout as aggressively and low as possible. And he immediately stopped chasing me. So further down the road, about 10 dogs who were on off leash in one house. I was told that the owner has about 20 dogs that are not leashed or fenced in, started chasing me. And once again, I got off my bike. I put my bike between me and the dogs, and I started shouting at them again. And 4 of them laid down in the middle of the road, and the other ones stopped in their tracks. And I just walked my bike away until I thought that they were out of chasing range, and they did not chase me. So I managed to get over my horrible, horrible fear of being chased by dogs. When I got to the campground, the owner saw how dehydrated I was and gave me Gatorade and water and put me under the care of a biker gang who were having a reunion, sort of a party that they have every year at this campground. They fed me dinner, and then the next morning, the campground owner gave me a ride to the Garden of the Gods, which is off the trail, but it's supposed to be very beautiful in the Shawnee National Forest, and I really wanted to see it. So after he dropped me off, I very quickly had bike troubles again, the same problems that I've been having all this time with not being able to change gears on hills. I had no service there to call for help, and I wound up talking with a family who were there with an RV and had a bunch of bikes attached to the back, and the father who was driving the RV helped me get my bike to a point where I could bike it again, and they gave me a ride to the next campground where I slept that night and went back to it the next day. And in Paducah, Kentucky, on the top left, I wound up going to yet another bike shop to get my bike repaired, and that got my bike to a place where it functioned for a while after that, fortunately. So at this point, shortly after this, I biked the entire length of the Ohio River. So on the top right, you can see the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio River. I describe it as the waters of the Ohio churned and mixed with the waters of the Mississippi. The river is so wide at their meeting, they seemed to open out into a great sea. The banks were steady, the tree lines consistent, and flush with the flat lands and fields. So shortly after the confluence, I got to Fort Kaskaskia, and again, the temperature was breaking 100 degrees, and I was biking up steep hills, and I was at least managing to get to the top of them for the most part without having to walk up them as I had on the early days of my bike trip. But when I got to Fort Kaskaskia, I was so tired, I sat on a curbstone about halfway up the hill and started chugging water. And as I was sitting there, a van pulled up and a bunch of archaeologists walked out of it to an excavation just over the hill. So I wound up spending the afternoon with Professor Mark Wagner, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, who is from the University of Illinois Carbondale, and his group of archaeologists, archaeology students who were excavating both the old French fort, and what they found was the fort, the American fort that Lewis and Clark would have gone to when they were going down the Ohio, up the Mississippi. So I spent the night at the campground there, and it was deathly hot, but absolutely beautiful. There were fireflies all over the campground, and I did my best to take some videos of them, but I did not do that experience justice. Shortly after that, I wound up in Hartford, Illinois, where the official Adventure Cycling Association map begins and where Camp Dubois is. And I started to see the first of the cliff sides that I was specifically going on this trip to see. And that night I camped not far from Camp Dubois, and I heard a pack of coyotes howling outside my tent at night. I decided specifically to not leave my tent until morning when I heard them so close by. I took a ferry over and reached the Missouri River the next day, and St. Charles, as you can see on the left, on the top left is a statue that's at the, there's a big park in St. Charles where the Katy Trail runs through, and the lower left is at the boathouse museums, the Lewis and Clark Boathouse Museums in St. Charles. The Katy Trail was an absolute pleasure to bike down. It's an old railroad, so it was very flat, and I was making about 75 miles a day, even in the heat. And I whizzed through the state of Missouri, and all along it, there are little historical markers that tell you what date Lewis and Clark were at that location in 1804. So here's a video of the cliffs. I was constantly trying to capture how incredibly tall these cliffs were. but I found it really impossible on the camera phone. So when I finished the Katy Trail, I didn't make it to the end because my route on the Lewis and Clark Trail detoured north when the Katy Trail continued south. But I biked to Arrow Rock State Park, which in the last day on the trail, it was starting to rain and a few different bridges were flooded out, and I had to take detours because of the flooding. And the night that I arrived at Arrow Rock State Park, I was woken up in the middle of the night by the camp attendant who told me there was a tornado warning. And that night I slept in the visitor center on my air mattress, my roll-up air mattress for my tent. And the next morning when the employees from the state park came in, I was told that the flooding was so bad it was reaching the underside of the overpasses of the highway. And I wound up getting a ride to a hotel because there was nowhere safe for me to camp in the near future. And as I was being driven down the highway, I saw how high the water line was on either side of the highway. So this is not a picture that I took. This is a picture from, I believe it was a Fox News, the local Fox News channel. But I could see that the level of the water was up to the lower branches of the trees. I could see houses that were this buried underwater, and I could see that street signs were being covered by the amount of water in the area. So in the coming weeks, it was raining off and on constantly, and I was dealing with flash flood warnings. And when I was biking through fields, I could see that the water line was about to go over the lip of the road. And so anytime that I was biking, I tried to bike as short a period as possible, because if it started to rain again, then I was going to be washed away. Once all the flooding was done with, at least as far as I was concerned, I got to Brownsville, Nebraska, and they have a steamboat hotel and a steamboat dinner cruise. So I went on the dinner cruise there. I'd planned to go down the Steamboat Trace, which is a bike path that goes along the Missouri River up on the Nebraska side from Brownsville to Nebraska City, Nebraska. And I found out when I got there that it was flooded out, or had been flooded out previously, not covered in water right now, but from a flood a few years previous, and they hadn't repaired it yet. But I talked to someone who told me it was passable by ATV. So I decided to give it a try, and I have my regrets. For one, the trail was so washed out that I was jerking up and down. My bike rack actually bent out of shape, and my pack was dragging against the back wheel of my bike. And I wound up having to carry my bike over a fence when I got to the far end, but I did finally make it to Nebraska City in one piece. So in the top right, you can see the Missouri River Basin Visitor Center, which is in Nebraska City. On the left, you can see some of the bluffs in Iowa, right outside of Council Bluffs. On that day, I was headed into Council Bluffs on the 4th of July, and I started my day with a flat tire, and I ended it biking what's called the Los Hills in Iowa, which are very much as that looks right there. They're very tall, rolling hills along the coast, along the waterline of the Missouri River, that are very loose soil. So these hills, the roads that you go down don't have any shoulder, and they don't have any guardrails. And as I was biking these hills, the brakes fell out of my bike, and I was biking hills with no way to stop if I needed to stop, and on very curvy roads with very unpredictable, steady traffic. So I was close enough to Council Bluffs to call an Uber and shove my bike into the trunk of the Uber, get to a hotel, and then I had to stay in Council Bluffs until the bike shop in Omaha City, or in Omaha, Nebraska, opened after the holiday weekend. And fortunately for me, my mom saw that I was in distress and did all she could to try to find someone who had brakes to replace on my bike, because due to COVID, there was a shortage of most bike parts. But in the end, we couldn't find new brakes. The bike repair shop replaced my bike rack that had bent out of shape and replaced my brakes with old brakes that had maybe 1,000 miles left in them, so I could at least get to another bike shop and warn them that I would need my brakes replaced before I got there. So in Sioux City, that was right over the border. Iowa meets South Dakota. I visited Sergeant Floyd's monument on Floyd's Bluff, and then the Sioux City Visitor Center, which I highly recommend. The front garden is beautiful. It's a bunch of sculptures of animals that Lewis and Clark would have encountered. And then this is Lewis and Clark Lake, which is in South Dakota. And the next day after this, I wound up in Vermilion, South Dakota, and I brought the rain with me. South Dakota was in drought, but I was ending droughts all over the country last summer. So when I got to this point, particularly by Lewis and Clark Lake, my dad had asked me if there was a point at which you would feel like you most need a support vehicle, when would it be? And my morale was gone. So I told my dad next week, because I knew that outside of Pierre, South Dakota, I was going to have a stretch of about 75 miles with nowhere to stop in drought. So nowhere to refill water, nowhere to camp if I was exhausted. And it had been incredibly hilly. So I knew that I was probably going to be at my wit's end on those hills. So my dad dropped everything and came to South Dakota. He had to fly into Colorado so he could get a rental car to come out to South Dakota. He met me in Chamberlain. But first I'm going to show you some of the gravel roads I was riding down as the weather was starting to turn and it was starting to rain again. In Vermilion, South Dakota, I went to Spirit Mound, which is yet another site that was specifically mentioned in the journals, but because I read an abridged version of the journals, I hadn't heard about it. And it really has a fascinating story. Basically, Lewis and Clark went ghost hunting at Spirit Mound. They heard rumors from local tribes that there were demons on this mound, and so they went to investigate and see what they could find. And I know there was a specific story about the weather being so hot, and I could very much relate to this, that Seaman, Lewis's dog, was so overheated that he had to send him back to the keel boat because he couldn't handle the hike. And he was getting prickly pears in his paws, which is so sad. The day after this, which is the day before I met up with my dad, the rack broke off of my bike. I was riding down a highway and a biker dude, saw me trying to MacGyver my bike back together with zip ties, and he pulled over and held up my bike and offered me some heavier duty zip ties to try to get my bike to stay on. And I got my bike to a point at which I could ride it again, and he left. And about half an hour, he came back and brought me hose clamps, which are basically metal zip ties, at least in the way that I use them, because he told me that the hardware store in the next town was closing before I could possibly get there. So it was very nice to help me find a solution for this really, really difficult problem. And I managed to make my bike rack solid enough to get back to my, to cross paths with my dad the next day, and I made it there fine. So I met up with my dad in Chamberlain, South Dakota, and the first day I biked with him as a support vehicle, I saw my first prairie dog town on the trail, and prairie dogs are my favorite animal. This is my prairie dog, Pomp. I got him on the trail because I love prairie dogs so much. And I spent a good half an hour here just watching the prairie dogs run around and smiling. Well, when I was in Pierre, South Dakota, I took another day off, and my dad and I went to a boat ramp so that I could put my feet into the Missouri River for the first time. And I do have a video of that. That is what they call a muddy Missouri right there. When we got to Pollock, South Dakota, I stayed at a campground right on the border of North Dakota and South Dakota, and I befriended a 13 striped ground squirrel. So I have a little video of that. He's so cute. They look like they shouldn't exist. Their stripes are just so fantastical. So shortly after that, we arrived in Bismarck, North Dakota, and my dad went home. I stayed in Bismarck for a day or two, and then my mom joined up with me because when I was in Omaha, Nebraska, I was at the point where I was convinced that I was going to need a support vehicle. For one, when I was at Fort Kaskaskia, some of the archaeologists that I was speaking with were telling me about they had family in South and North Dakota and that the drought was insane there and that there were fires already starting in June. So I was very aware that I was going to be biking through many of these areas when it was forest fire season. Not only that, I was biking through grizzly bear country, and the closer I got to the mountains, the more intimidated I got by the fact that I was going to be close to grizzly bears sooner rather than later. So shortly after my mom joined up with us, we got to Fort Mandan, and I visited the reproduction of the fort. I talked with an interpreter there named Shannon for probably an hour, just nerding out about the history of the Lewis and Clark expedition and learning a whole bunch from her. She's very knowledgeable. And one of the other interpreters, and it's been so long, I forget her name, I think it was Sarah, told me if I stuck around, I could see Patrick Gass's original journal. So I stuck around and I went into their conference meeting room and saw Patrick Gass's journal. Not long after that, I had more bike troubles. I was biking through Montana and it was so hot that, well, I thought initially it was my cables, the way my cables had been consistently a problem. And by this point, my dad had convinced me that I needed to know how to solve that problem myself, since I'd had to go to so many bike shops. He was not wrong there. And I figured out how to do it at this point, but no matter what I did, I would get it working on when it was not being ridden on, and then the second I got on my bike, it would stop working again. So I wound up having to drive to Lewistown, Montana, to a bike shop, and the bike shop owner came to help me, even though it was the day before his wedding, and did bike repairs. He wound up having to help me out twice because he was having the same problem that I was, where it worked fine on the stand, and then the second that I rode it, it didn't work. And it turned out that it was so hot that the derailleur melted off of my bike. So I wound up MacGyvering a solution together again with the hose clamps that I had used previously, because at this point I wasn't carrying my gear on my bike, so I didn't need to have my rack on it. So I used those same hose clamps from before to keep my derailleur from sliding down. When I got to Fort Benton, Montana, my mom and I stumbled upon a trivia night and we kicked butt, we won. So that was a highlight in Fort Benton. I learned about they have Missouri River guided canoe trips down the Missouri through the White Cliffs, and I really want to do that in the near future because it sounds really cool. And not long after that, well, first off, in Jordan and Lewistown and in Fort Benton, you could see the smoke veiling the nearby buttes from the nearby fires. So I was starting to officially get into the territory that I was worried about with forest fires. And not long after that, I arrived in Great Falls, Montana. So when I was at the Lewis and Clark Boathouse Museum in Montana, not in Missouri, in St. Charles, Missouri, one of the people who worked there told me that if I could, I should try to hear the falls before I saw the falls. So I did just that. We drove to the north shore of the Missouri there to do the hike to see the falls, the Great Falls. And I specifically took pictures of the prickly pears because the portage of Great Falls is very much a story in my mind, and the being stabbed through your moccasins by prickly pears was something that I was thinking about as I had much better soles to my shoes on this hike. So I have a short video here of me first seeing the falls. Oh, that's good. You can hear them in the background. That's not cars, that's falls. So after Great Falls, I stopped at Buffalo Jump State Park in Montana and saw my last prairie dog town on the trail. It was a bit of a detour, but I had not seen a buffalo jump up to this point, so I thought it was worth the detour. And then on my way from Great Falls down to Helena, there were major forest fires very nearby the highway that I was biking down, and I was approaching my first mountains, my first actual Rocky Mountains, because I went through the Judith Mountains, but they're quite a distance away from the Continental Divide. So it's very pretty, and it was surprisingly easy biking, at least in this portion. And then on the stretch to Great Falls, there's a boat tour of the gateway to the mountains. So I made sure to go on that. It was definitely one of the highlights of my trip. I learned about the Man Gulch fire. It happened in, I think, the 40s, and saw just, this was the most isolated I had been because it's in the midst of Helena National Forest. On the bottom left, you can see the campground I slept at with my mom the night before. We were at first the only people to have to be tent camping, but a family came up who were half of them did not seem to want to be there. They were arguing the entire time. So my mom and I put earplugs in and went to bed very early. And the next morning I woke up and I saw the state in which they had left their campground. And I was furious because they left dog food out. They left all of their coolers out with their food. They left garbage bags hanging on the number sign for what campsite they were on. And this was bear country. A woman had been killed not far away from here last summer. So I was furious that they not only put themselves in danger, but they put me in danger. I actually wrote a passive aggressive note and left it on their windshield of their car. So after this, I made it to Three Forks and the headwaters of the Missouri River. So as you can see, I needed to put my feet in the Missouri again here. And the next day I biked by the Lewis and Clark Caverns. I did go on a tour of the caverns, which if you like caves is worth it. If you don't do it. If you're claustrophobic, maybe not. But this was the worst of the smoke that I had experienced up to this point. If you can see in the bottom left, that is me with sunglasses on, not because it was sunny, but to keep the fire debris out of my eyes, and with a gaiter over my mouth. I wetted it with water to try to keep the smoke out of my lungs. But that day was one of the hardest days of biking that I had. I was actually getting physically ill. I was nauseous and I was lightheaded from all of the smoke. As you can see, when I got to Beaverhead Rock that day, it was veiled by smoke, and I could not get a great picture of it, which was kind of sad. I was also a little disappointed that it was privately owned and I couldn't get any closer to it than this. And then my first mountain pass was the Lemhi Pass, which is mostly gravel on the Montana side. And as you can see, there's smoke everywhere, but I was in complete denial, and I convinced myself that it was mist and not smoke, even though I had just biked through so much smoke, I was getting ill. And every curve that I went around, I was afraid that because of the mist or because of the smoke, I was going to startle a bear. The day before in Three Forks, I had bought a bike bell and attached it to my bike so that I was constantly ringing a bell on gravel road because of the jostling on the gravel, so that I wouldn't startle a bear, because my impression is that you're more likely to get attacked by a bear if you startle it than if you just make your presence known. This is also where the very beginning of the heretofore and deemed endless Missouri is. So I made it to the top of the Continental Divide that day, and the road was closed on the downhill portion because of forest fires. So I made it all the way to the top and then couldn't coast down, which was really disappointing because I hadn't really had the joy of going down a mountain yet. And I promise you, it is a joy to bike down a mountain. So I wound up, fortunately, because I had my mom as a support vehicle, I wound up driving her car down and then up another pass because I didn't have to bike my way out of that situation. And I figured nothing is easier than biking down a mountain, so I didn't have to feel bad about shorting myself a few miles. So on the other side of this pass is first Tendoy, Idaho, but the Salmon River in Salmon, Idaho. We went on a bit of a spur down the Salmon River just to see it because it is absolutely gorgeous. And then we stayed in Salmon, Idaho for a few days. Because I had a car or access to a car with my mom, I would hunker down in one place with our campsite and then bike further and further down the road and then come back to the campsite at night and then find the next campground. So I wound up going to 2 days worth of lectures at the Sacagawea Interpretive Center because a woman named Judy does something like daily talks there, or at least very regular talks there. And I wanted to go to every lecture that I could while I was in the area. So the next mountain pass was the Lost Trail, and that brought me to Sula, Montana, back in Montana. And I took a day off near Traveler's Rest and spent my entire day off in Missoula, Montana. So in the top right, you can see the reproduction of the encampment there, and then the view from the top of the next pass, the Lolo Pass. So this is, you can see the fire damage down the Lolo Trail. I don't know when that fire was, but there was an undergrowth, so it seemed fairly recent. If it wasn't this year, in 2021, it seemed like at least the last year. So when I got to the top of the Lolo Pass, well, there were a lot of mile markers that weren't so accurate. I think there were 2 that said there were 5 miles left till the visitor center, and 2 that said that there were 2 miles left to the visitor center. So by the time I got to the top, my muscles were twitching. I was so exhausted. And I have this selfie on the top right because I couldn't control my face enough to smile. It took me a few minutes to actually get a picture of myself smiling at the top of this mountain pass because it was my last mountain pass, or at least my last Rocky Mountain Pass. I went out for a bit of an excursion down the Lolo Trail by car because the Lolo Trail is 200 something miles and parts of it were closed due to fire traffic. So I convinced my mom to let me drive down it, and God bless her because she was scared for her life the entire time. But I thought it was worth it. The ridgeline was gorgeous up there. And then not long after that, I made it to the Snake River in Washington. I just can't believe how beautiful and reflective this river is. I'm in the windswept deserts of Washington. Oop. And then this is a video of the Columbia River. I just so you can see what the cliffs along the Columbia River are like, because they're basalt cliffs, so they're black, and I'd never seen anything like them before. So in Oregon, I made it to Cascade Locks, where the Bridge of the Gods is, which is one of the northern parts of the Pacific Crest Trail. And in my head, I'd like to think that someday I'll hike the Pacific Crest Trail, but we'll see. and more sites of the Columbia River on the Oregon side. I made it to the Cascade Mountains, which I completely forgot about it in the midst of the Rocky Mountains, and was trying to see as many of the Cascade waterfalls that I could, but we made it there on Labor Day weekend. And my mom was terrified for my life. I wasn't so terrified. I felt at that point I had dealt with a lot worse by bike, but there was no shoulder for me to bike on, and there was a heavy traffic because everybody decided that Labor Day weekend was the weekend to see the falls. So I let her convince me very, very begrudgingly to be driven past the worst of the traffic. And that day we got to Portland to visit friends in Portland. And not long after that, I arrived at Fort Clatsop. And I first arrived at Fort Clatsop at the end of the day. They were about to close. And then the next morning, biked to Cape Disappointment, and then biked back over to Seaside, where I met the Pacific Ocean. So I went to Fort Clatsop twice. But the first time that I went there, the ranger there let me lower the flag at Fort Clatsop, which seemed like a very appropriate way to end my trip. So. And then the next day I made it to the Pacific. Ooh. Now what you can't see there is it was a low tide and I had to carry my bike down the entire length of the beach, which is not something that I ever thought was going to be an issue, but that is the time that I got there. So here I have a list of all of the different times that I needed to repair my bike and replace things, because it happened so much more than I ever anticipated. And that's it. So now if we want to do a Q&A, now would be the time.
Great. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate you telling us that story. And I'm sure there's so much more, right?
Yes.
So many unsaid things.
Yes.
So yeah, we have time. We have lots of time. If anybody has any questions, then please feel free to unmute.
I see Shannon. Hello, Shannon. I mentioned her.
Yes. Yes, you did.
Yes.
I was able to hop from the front desk of my work for a moment and watch.
Oh, yay!
I made it.
I'm glad you're here.
Okay, I see we have a hand raised from Jennifer. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself.
I just want to say you're one of the bravest women I've ever heard talk. That was phenomenal. It was really, really wonderful. Did you have any fear for your own safety from humans? I mean,
Yes.
the animals, yeah. The man who helped you that time, that was great. Went back and got the clamp.
Yes.
But
I did choose to stay at a hotel that night just because he was staying at the campground that I planned to stay at, and I didn't want him to think that I owed him anything for helping me out.
Smart move.
But yeah, I had a few instances where I was afraid of people. When I was I think it was in Indiana, I stayed at a campground that was specifically an RV campground, and I did not sleep that night because I wasn't supposed to be there and there was no one else there. So I was worried that I was going to be chased out of it in the middle of the night. And then there was one instance on the Katy Trail where I stopped because it had been so hot at a bar that served food so I could have lunch. And there was a very drunk man there who kept on asking me where I was going to sleep that night. So again, I chose to stay in a hotel because he listed every campground that I could possibly get to by bike for the rest of the day. So I wound up staying at a hotel in Jefferson City instead of camping that night.
Yeah.
But those are the specific ones that I can remember. And then there was also an instance near Three Forks where we were at a campground that had a car that had been abandoned in it. And my mom was with me at this time, at least, but it had a sticker on it saying that it was going to be towed away because it had been abandoned for so long. And all I could think was that somebody had been killed or something there, and that's why the car was still there. We scared a few people off because that was the only campsite left in the campground, and we mentioned that we were worried there was a body in the trunk, and that lady left. I think that was wise.
Oh, gosh. Well, that was just a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. What are some of your favorite places that you went to, and what visitor centers did you like the best?
Let's see. For visitor centers, I enjoyed the Nebraska City one was really great and interactive, especially if you're there with kids. There's a lot of almost games there to demonstrate what the Lewis and Clark expedition experienced. I enjoyed Fort Mandan was the only one that actually had a guided tour of the fort that I, at least when I was there. So having somebody who knew what they were talking about talk me through it was really important to me, because it makes it more real to you if you're talking with somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. And then beyond that, I really enjoyed the Nez Perce National Historic Monument or Site in Lewiston, because I enjoyed seeing, there was a film there that talked about the Nez Perce tribe and what they're doing today, as well as talked about the art. There was so much artwork by the tribes, and I actually saw a talk through Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation about the works that are in that museum, which was fascinating. And it was really nice to come back to it and see things that I had seen and be told the details about them. There was one piece that they used thimbles as decoration because they got trade goods, and I was absolutely fascinated by that. So those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
Fantastic. Okay, any other questions, folks? Oh, did you stop at Fort Union in North Dakota?
I did not. It was on I had planned to do it, but it was very often because I was biking from place to place. That was how much I could fit into a day, because I was biking at least 50 miles a day. So I had to prioritize things, but it's one of the reasons that I want to go back on the trail, probably by car, is so that I can see all of the things that I didn't manage to see and be able to bounce over from side to side of the river, because it's not possible when you're biking down one side to see what's on the other side of the river.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Kay, do you have a question?
Can you tell us anything about your novel?
I'm still in, so I'm thinking it's going to be a few volumes at this point, just because there's so much that I want to include. I have it written up to the first winter in St. Louis, and then them departing St. Louis. But I think that one in itself is going to be its own volume, and then I'm going to have to the Pacific and then return or something like that. I haven't figured out the arcs that are going to make it into a trilogy, but yeah, it's about not just about the history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but I want to have a message of kind of learning from the indigenous communities along the way and seeing what where our blind spots are, like how much better we could be doing if we actually listened to what the people around us were saying.
Thank you.
So we have other questions in the chat. Did you encounter other long haul cyclists, and did you ride with others at some points in time?
I did, but not specifically on the trail that I was going on. So I passed by somebody who was going, actually the day that I met up with my dad in Chamberlain, I passed by somebody who was going west to east on the Lewis and Clark Trail while I was going east to west. And I had him stop long enough for me to ask him how the mountains were, but I don't think they were on fire when he was there, which is a reason to go in that direction. And then there were a few campsites that I went to that there were people who were definitely cycling, but they weren't cycling the route that I was cycling. I passed a few people on the Katy Trail who were going on rides just across the Katy Trail because it is such a common place to bike and a common way to do a cross-country trip because it gets you through the state of Missouri incredibly fast. And then when I was in Union, Kentucky, I stumbled upon two cyclists who were from Union, Kentucky, who I wound up staying in their house that night because they were a married couple. And I warned them about a dog who was trying to chase me because they were biking in the opposite direction. They told me if I wanted to sleep in a bed tonight that I could wait on their porch and that they'd let me sleep at their house. And I got to do laundry there too. It was by Big Bone Lick, Kentucky.
Nice. Yeah, it's fascinating how wonderful like strangers can be when you're out adventuring. It's really nice to hear those stories. So did you stay on the adventure cycling route or did you improvise a lot?
I mostly stayed on the adventure cycling route. I think there was only one point in which I diverted, but only because there was 15 miles of road work. Actually, maybe that was 2 points at which I diverted because there was a whole lot of road work and I just could, like, I can't as a bike follow a pilot car. That's just not possible. So
yeah, that makes sense. And have you thought about designing a travel plan for others who may want to do what you did? I think that's a great.
I have not thought about doing that. I have had a lot of people ask me if I'm going to write a memoir about it, which is the closest I've thought to doing it. But having done it, I don't know that I advise the route that I took from Pittsburgh to St. Louis. I think that I was being much more of a stickler for following the Ohio River than I actually had to be, and that there are better, nicer ways to bike that I just wasn't aware of.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you have to do that section again.
Yeah. Let's see if I can get the time off for that.
Yeah, right, of course. Bernice, did you have a question? You're muted. Bernice, you are still muted.
There I am.
Yeah.
Hi, Megan.
Hello.
I'm from Philadelphia, and I was mesmerized by your presentation. I mean, since the pandemic, I'm afraid even to go downtown to Center City, where I used to go all the time. And here you've done such. I've been to a number of places where you were, and it just is fascinating. My hearing is not that great, and I may have missed it. Did you end up ever getting a new bicycle? I mean,
I did not. So the bow on the end of this bike trip is my mom and I were on the Pacific Coast, visited family in California, and then drove back to Massachusetts since I'm from Massachusetts. And on the way back, right outside of Kansas City, Missouri, we got rear-ended and my bike got totaled. So I've been recovering from a concussion over the past year and was not allowed to bike for 6 months after that, just because if I get another concussion, then I will have permanent brain damage. And now that I am biking again, I'm borrowing a bike from my dad, but I haven't replaced that bike yet. I plan to mount the handlebars though, like a trophy on my wall.
also, did you ever encounter, since it was still not almost the height of the pandemic or a lot, any COVID problems were any place where you went where it was a little bit dicey?
I wore a mask anytime that I was inside, so I wasn't so worried. And I spent more than 90% of my time outside, not near people. So I wasn't particularly worried about it, but I was going through states that weren't as cautious about it. So I
I
felt like I
know.
had to overcompensate.
Well, good. I'm glad you survived and
Yeah.
stayed well.
I did not get COVID in that entire time. I had that respiratory infection, but I think it's a miracle no one got COVID at the wedding, but yeah.
You're good. I'm glad you didn't.
So would you consider a different brand of bike for long distance trips?
I don't know if I would consider a different brand of bike so much as a different type of bike. I think for that specific trip, if I had shocks on my bike, I feel like it would have been a lot easier to go down all these gravel roads because I didn't anticipate biking down so many gravel roads. And then I bought a bike with a titanium fork that didn't let me put bags on the front of my bike. I had to backload everything, which made things much more difficult. And I bought the bike for the weight of it because I wanted to be lighter so that it'd have less weight to carry. And I think a sturdier bike might have served me a bit better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I know anything about bikes, but so we have another one. Weren't there interpreters at Fort Clatsop that you were able to talk to?
Because I got there right before they closed, I didn't really have a chance to talk to them, but I talked briefly with one the second day, but I didn't get a tour of the fort. He was talking about the trade goods that they brought with them. So I got to learn something about it, but it wasn't as immersive.
Yeah.
Though he was dressed up as a member of the expedition, so that was nice.
That's neat. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions, folks? Jennifer?
My husband and I recently came from Louisville back to New Jersey, and we stopped at the George Rogers Clark site, and this is what is there now.
Oh goodness, that's even less.
Wow.
So can't tell where I'm holding this thing.
I had read, hopefully
Um,
this is still true, but I had read that they do plan on rebuilding it and that they're working on getting the funds for it. But
Oh, good.
I don't know that the house that was there was the one. I think that it was a replica anyway. I don't think it was the one
It
that
was. Yeah, we saw that in 2013, and it was a replica. It was wonderful. It gave you a real feeling of it.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. I don't know that many of
Oh.
us knew that it was brought down so small now. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, I just want to thank you again, Megan. That was a really fantastic program. And I think that, you're encouraging a lot of us to get back onto the trail, which is what we really want to do and what we're here to promote. So thank you for that. Folks, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. You can just go to YouTube and look up the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. You'll find us. And you can watch a bunch of other educational videos from other presentations. Some of them are this style on Zoom and others are in-person recordings. So check that out. And I just want to remind everybody, we have a lot of communications that are going to be going out to our members here shortly. I know we have some folks on here that are not members, so I encourage you to join us. You can do that on lewisandclark.org/join. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime about anything regarding Lewis and Clark. We do have our research library with our librarian on staff. And if anybody has any ideas for future programs or any ways that you think that you want to get out and recreate on the Lewis and Clark Trail, please give me a call and we can definitely talk through any of your ideas. Thank you again, everybody. And thank you, Megan, for your time. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your Saturday, folks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Megan.
Megan. It was
Terrific.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
It was awesome, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
You were terrific.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.